A retired farmer thought he had already learned how to live with loss, until the night his black horse fell into a hidden hole, forcing him to make the most painful decision of his entire life. Before we begin, subscribe, like, and leave a comment to help us continue sharing emotional stories from the heartland with those who understand love, loss, and farewell. At 79 years old, Harold Whitman believed he had already heard every sound grief could make. The hollow silence of an empty house, the slow creak of a chair that no one else ever sat in anymore, the quiet ache that followed him from room to room since his wife passed. But the sound that cut through the cold evening air that night, that sound was different. A deep panic cry, raw, broken, impossible to ignore. Harold froze on the porch, one hand gripping the railing as his heart lurched painfully in his chest. "No," he whispered. "No, not you." The cry came again. His black horse, Eben. Harold moved faster than his aging body should have allowed, grabbing his coat and flashlight as he hurried toward the pasture. The moon hid behind thick clouds, leaving the land cloaked in darkness. The grass was wet, the ground soft from recent rain. "Eben!" Harold called, his voice shaking. "Where are you, boy?" The beam of his flashlight cut across the field, trembling as much as his hands. Then he saw it, a dark shape near the far fence line, an unnatural dip in the ground, and Eben's head, barely visible above the earth. Harold's breath left him in a broken gasp. The horse had fallen into an old sinkhole, long forgotten, hidden beneath grass and soil. The hole was narrow but deep, its edges crumbling. Eben's body was trapped, legs twisted beneath him, chest heaving with fear and pain. "Oh, God!" Harold whispered, dropping to his knees at the edge. "Oh, no, no!" Eben thrashed weakly, dirt sliding into the hole with every movement. "Easy," Harold begged, tears streaming freely now. "Easy, boy. I'm here." Eben's eyes locked onto Harold's, wide, terrified, searching for a man who had never failed him. Harold's hands shook as he reached down, but the hole was too deep, too unstable. Every shift of his weight sent more dirt cascading inward. His mind raced. No neighbors close enough. No strength left in his arms. No rope long enough. No time. Harold had raised Eben from a foal after retiring from farming, a quiet companion in the years when the world grew smaller and lonelier. Eben had walked beside him through grief, through mornings that felt too heavy to face alone. "I promised you I'd keep you safe," Harold sobbed. "I promised." Eben let out a soft, broken whine, trembling violently. Blood darkened the soil near one twisted leg. Harold knew horses. He knew pain. And he knew when something was beyond saving. The realization hit him slowly, then all at once. This was not a rescue. This was a goodbye. Harold pressed his forehead against the cold earth, shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I should have filled this hole years ago. I should have." Eben stilled suddenly, breathing hard, eyes never leaving Harold's face. Waiting, trusting. Harold wiped his face with trembling hands and forced himself to stand. His legs barely held him. "I won't leave you alone," he said softly. "I swear that." But deep in his chest, Harold already felt the terrible weight of the decision forming, the one no man ever wants to make for the creature he loves most. The wind rose gently, carrying the smell of wet soil and the quiet truth of the night. Harold turned away from a hole for the first time, not to abandon Eben, but to prepare himself for the act that would haunt him forever. Harold Whitman stood a few yards away from the hole, his back turned to it, his chest rising and falling as if he were trying to outrun his own thoughts. The night air burned cold in his lungs. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to do something, yet his body felt rooted in place. Behind him, Eben shifted weakly. The sound of dirt sliding deeper into the hole made Harold flinch. He turned back slowly, dread tightening around his heart like a vice. "I'm here," he said quickly, voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere." Eben's breathing was labored now, each breath scraping through his chest. One front leg was pinned at an unnatural angle, the joint twisted in a way Harold had only seen once before, years ago, during a storm, when a neighbor's mare had broken her leg in a pasture accident. That mare never walked again. Harold's throat closed. "No," he whispered. "Not yet. Don't you give up yet." He knelt carefully at the edge of the hole, testing the ground with one knee. The soil crumbled instantly, falling away in loose chunks. The hole widened with every movement, swallowing more earth, threatening to bury Eben alive if he struggled again. "Easy, boy," Harold begged. "Please stay still." Eben obeyed. That was the part that broke Harold the most. The horse trusted him completely. Harold scanned the pasture, wildly, mind racing. A rope? He could try to lower one. But Eben was too heavy, and Harold's arms shook even lifting the flashlight now. A tractor? Sold years ago when retirement forced his hand. A neighbor? The nearest farmhouse was over a mile away, and Harold doubted he could even make the walk without collapsing. He pulled his phone from his pocket. No signal. Of course. The land that had given him a lifetime of work had finally taken its due. "I should have checked this field," Harold muttered bitterly. "I should have remembered the old sinkholes. I should have—" His voice broke. Eben let out a low, exhausted sound, more breath than whinny. His eyes were glassy now, pain and fear dulling the spark Harold loved so much. Harold reached down, fingers brushing Eben's forehead. The horse leaned into the touch instinctively, desperate for comfort. "I'm so sorry," Harold whispered. "I failed you." Memories came unbidden. Eben as a foe, clumsy and curious, following Harold around the barn. Eben standing beside him the day he buried his wife, silent and steady. Eben waiting at the gate every morning, reminding Harold that life still required him. "You gave me a reason to wake up," Harold said softly. "I don't know how I'll do that without you." The truth pressed heavier with every passing second. Even if help came, even if machinery arrived, Eben's leg was shattered. Harold knew what that meant. A horse couldn't survive it, not without agony, not without months of suffering, not at his age. Harold squeezed his eyes shut, tears spilling freely now. "I promised her," he whispered, thinking of his wife. "I promised I'd take care of what we loved." The wind stirred the grass gently, carrying the smell of damp earth and inevitability. Eben's breathing hitched suddenly, a sharp gasp followed by a long, strained exhale. His body trembled violently. Panic surged through Harold. "No, no, stay with me," he said urgently. "Look at me." Eben's eyes fluttered, struggling to stay open. Harold's heart shattered piece by piece. He stood slowly, legs weak, turning away again, not because he wanted to leave, but because he needed a moment to survive what he already knew. Near the fence leaned the old wooden shed. Inside it hung the rifle. Harold hadn't touched it in years. He walked toward the shed as if in a dream, each step heavier than the last. His hands shook violently as he reached for the door. The hinges groaned, a sound too loud in the quiet night. He stopped. "No," he whispered. "I can't." He leaned his forehead against the rough wood, shoulders shaking. There has to be another way. Behind him, Eben cried out again, a sharp, broken sound filled with fear and pain. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was exhausted. Harold turned slowly. The sound tore through him with cruel clarity. This wasn't about saving Eben anymore. It was about ending his suffering. Harold returned to the hole, kneeling once more, his face wet with tears. He placed both hands on Eben's head, pressing his forehead against the horse's. "I won't let you hurt any more," he whispered. "I swear to you." Eben breathed against him, warm and alive, trusting him. Harold stayed like that for a long time, listening to the horse's breathing, memorizing the feel of his coat, the weight of his presence. Every second felt stolen. When he finally stood again, his decision had settled like stone in his chest. "I'll stay with you until the end," he said quietly. "You won't be alone, not for one moment." The moon slipped free from the clouds, casting pale light over the pasture, over the hole, the horse, and the man who loved him too deeply to let him suffer. Harold turned toward the shed once more. This time, he didn't stop. The shed smelled of old wood, oil, and memories Harold Whitman wished he could forget. He stood just inside the doorway, staring at the rifle hanging on the wall. Dust clung to the barrel. Cobwebs stretched between forgotten tools. This place had once been about protection, keeping predators away from livestock, keeping food on the table. Tonight, it was something else entirely. Harold's hands shook as he reached for the rifle, fingers stiff and reluctant. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of every mistake he'd ever made. He leaned it against the wall and rested his forehead there, breathing shallowly. "I don't want to do this," he whispered into the dark. "I don't know how to do this." Outside, Eben cried again, weaker now, thinner. The sound didn't demand action. It begged for relief. Harold closed his eyes. He remembered the first time he'd seen Eben stumble as a foal, legs too long for his body, curiosity outrunning balance. Harold had laughed then, scooped the little horse up in his arms, promised he'd always be there to catch him. He hadn't imagined this kind of catching. Harold wiped his face, steadied himself, and stepped back into the night. The pasture looked different now, smaller, crueler. The hole yawned open like a wound in the earth. Its edges collapsed further with time. Eben lay trapped inside, his body angled awkwardly, breath coming in shallow, rattling pulls. When Harold approached, Eben lifted his head slightly, still looking for him. "I'm here," Harold said quickly, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm right here, boy." He knelt at the edge again, careful not to disturb the fragile ground. He set the rifle down behind him, out of Eben's sight. This wasn't about the weapon. It was about the moment. Harold reached down and rested his hand against Eben's cheek. The horse leaned into the touch immediately, eyes soft despite the pain clouding them. "You were always gentle," Harold whispered, "even when the world wasn't." Eben's breath fluttered, warm against Harold's wrist. Harold talked, because silence felt like betrayal. He talked about the mornings they'd watched the sun rise together, about how Eben used to wait at the fence, patient as stone whenever Harold was late, about the way the horse seemed to understand grief when words failed. "You stayed when everyone else was gone," Harold said, voice breaking. "You never asked me to be anything but here." A tear fell from Harold's chin and disappeared into the dirt below. Eben shifted suddenly, a spasm of pain tearing through him. He cried out, sharp, involuntary. Harold felt his resolve crack. "No, no," he whispered urgently. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He pressed his forehead against Eben's, holding him there, breathing together until the trembling eased. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had no meaning anymore. At last, Harold sat back on his heels, chest tight, heart hammering. He picked up the rifle with trembling hands, checked it mechanically, the way muscle memory demanded, then lowered it again. His hand shook too badly. "I can't," he sobbed quietly. "I don't know if I can." Eben's breathing faltered again, growing uneven. Foam flecked his lips. His eyes rolled slightly, struggling to focus. Harold's heart shattered. This wasn't mercy delayed. This was mercy denied. Harold took a slow, shaking breath and steadied the rifle against the ground, never pointing it yet. He leaned forward again, one hand still resting on Eben's face. "Listen to me," he whispered. "You did everything right. None of this is your fault." Eben's eye flickered, meeting Harold's. Still trusting. Harold felt something inside him break open. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. "I won't let you be afraid," he said softly. "I promise you that." He stayed close, murmuring gentle words, stroking the horse's face, waiting until Eben's breathing slowed just a little, until the panic softened into exhaustion. When Harold finally lifted the rifle, his hands were steadier than before, not because he felt strong, but because love demanded it. "I'm right here," he whispered. "Just rest." The sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, just final. Harold didn't remember lowering the rifle. He didn't remember how long he stayed there afterward, cradling Eben's head, rocking gently like a man holding a child who would never wake again. The night seemed to hold its breath. Eventually, Harold looked up at the sky. The moon was high now, pale and indifferent. Stars blinked faintly above, unchanged. "I hope it didn't hurt," he whispered into the quiet. "I hope you felt how loved you were." He stayed there long after the earth had grown cold, after Eben's warmth faded, after the pain settled into something deeper and quieter. When Harold finally stood, His legs barely obeyed him. He covered Eben's face gently with his coat. "I'll come back for you in the morning," he said softly. "I won't leave you alone." The walk back to the house felt endless. The pasture was silent now. No cries, no movement, just the sound of an old man's boots dragging through the grass, carrying a grief heavier than any burden he had ever known. The days that followed blurred together like a long, gray winter afternoon. Harold Whitman moved through them on habit alone. He woke before dawn out of instinct, not need. He poured coffee he barely drank. He sat by the window and watched the pasture where Eben used to stand, half expecting to see the familiar black shape at the fence. Each time he remembered the truth, it felt like losing him all over again. On the third morning, Harold noticed something strange. The gate was open. He frowned, heart giving a sudden, painful lurch. He was certain he'd latched it the night before. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, joint stiff, breath fogging the cold air. The pasture lay quiet, dew clinging to the grass. As Harold walked toward the gate, he saw fresh tracks in the soil, boot prints, not his. Smaller, lighter. Someone had been there. His chest tightened with a mix of confusion and irritation. He didn't get visitors. Not anymore. Harold followed the prints toward the far end of the field, toward the grave. He stopped short. A small bundle of wildflowers rested on the flat stone he'd placed there. Simple flowers, daisies and weeds gathered by hand, arranged carefully, respectfully. Harold's breath caught. He knelt slowly, fingers brushing the petals. They were fresh. "I didn't put these here," he whispered. A memory stirred, faint, distant. Eben had always liked this part of the pasture. He'd often stand by the fence when the neighbors' grandchildren passed by on their way to school, ears flicking, curious but gentle. Harold stood and looked toward the dirt road. At the far end, a figure lingered. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, stood holding a bicycle, helmet crooked on his head. He watched Harold with uncertainty, ready to flee if told to. Harold's heart softened despite himself. "Hey," he called gently. "You there?" The boy flinched, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Did you put the flowers there?" The boy swallowed. "I'm sorry if that wasn't okay. I wanted to say goodbye." Harold walked closer, slowly. "You knew my horse?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Eben. He always waited at the fence. He let me pet him. My mom said he was special." Harold felt something shift in his chest, a quiet, aching warmth beneath the grief. "He was," Harold said softly. The boy hesitated. "When he didn't come anymore, my mom said he passed. I didn't want him to be alone." Harold's eyes burned. He looked back at the flowers, then at the boy. "Thank you," he said. "That means more than you know." The boy smiled shyly, then climbed onto his bike and rode off, glancing back once before disappearing down the road. Harold stood there long after the dust settled. Eben had mattered, not just to him. That afternoon, Harold opened the old barn for the first time since the accident. Dust motes danced in the sunlight as he stepped inside. Eben's stall stood empty, halter still hanging on the hook. Harold reached up and took it down, holding it in his hands. "I don't know what to do with all this love," he murmured. "It doesn't just disappear." A sound drifted in through the open barn door. Laughter. Harold turned. The neighbors' grandchildren were walking past again, just like always. One of them pointed toward the pasture. "That's where the horse used to be." Harold surprised himself by stepping outside. His name was Eben. He said gently. The children looked at him, wide-eyed. "Can we see?" Harold hesitated, then nodded. "You can." He led them to the grave, explaining quietly what had happened. The children listened in solemn silence. One of them placed a small stone beside the flowers. "For him," she said. That night, Harold sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug. The house was still quiet, painfully so, but something had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of memory, of meaning, of the proof that love leaves echoes. Harold rose slowly and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay old photographs. Eben as a foal, Eben beside Harold in the snow, Eben standing watchfully at the fence. He laid them out carefully. "I don't think you were only meant for me," Harold whispered. "I think you were meant to teach me something." The next morning, Harold nailed a small sign to the fence near the road. Ebbins Field, all gentle souls welcome. People began to stop. Not crowds, just a few at a time. Neighbors, children, travelers who heard the story and wanted to see the place where a horse had been deeply loved. Harold spoke when he could, listened when he couldn't. Grief didn't leave. But it changed. It became something he could carry. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Harold stood by the grave and rested his hand on the stone. "You didn't leave me empty," he said softly. "You left me connected." The wind brushed the grass, gentle and warm. For the first time since the night everything ended, Harold smiled. Harold Whitman had always believed grief was something a man endured quietly. You carried it. You survived it. You waited for it to dull. But as the days passed, Harold began to understand something different. Grief didn't disappear. It asked something of him. Every morning, Harold still walked the pasture. He still stopped at the stone where Eben rested. He still spoke to him, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in his heart. But now he noticed other things. The way people slowed when they passed the fence. The way children lingered, reading the sign. The way silence felt less like absence and more like respect. One afternoon, a woman stopped at the gate. She introduced herself as Martha, a volunteer from a nearby equine rescue. She'd heard about Eben, about the field. "I didn't come to take anything," she said gently. "I just wanted to see the place." Harold nodded and opened the gate. They walked together in silence for a while. When they reached the grave, Martha stopped, her eyes soft. "You loved him deeply," she said. Harold swallowed. "I still do." Martha hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Sometimes when a bond is that strong, it doesn't end. It redirects." Harold looked at her, uncertain. "There are horses," she continued. "Old ones, injured ones, ones people give up on. They need quiet places, gentle hands." Harold's chest tightened. "I'm too old to start over," he said. Martha smiled sadly. "You're exactly the right age to understand what they need." That night, Harold didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pasture through the dark window. Memories pressed in not only of Eben, but of himself. The man he had been before the losses. The man he had become after. He thought about the empty barn, the unused stalls, the land that still breathed, waiting. At dawn, Harold made his decision. He called Martha. "I don't want the farm to be quiet anymore," he said simply. The changes came slowly. Harold didn't rush. He learned. He prepared. He fixed fences with aching hands. He cleaned stalls he never thought he'd use again. He rested when his body demanded it. The first horse arrived 2 weeks later. An old mare named Luna, blind in one eye, ribs too visible, spirit worn thin by neglect. She stepped off the trailer hesitantly, head low, unsure. Harold stood still, heart pounding. He didn't reach for her. He waited. Luna sniffed the air, then took a cautious step forward. Then another. When she finally touched her nose to Harold's hand, his breath caught. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe here." More followed. A limping gelding. A nervous pony. A horse too old to be useful anywhere else. Harold gave them time. Space. Routine. What Eben had once given him. The farm changed. It wasn't louder. It was alive. One evening, Harold stood alone by Eben's grave. He looked back at the pasture. Horses grazing quietly under the setting sun. "I was wrong," he said softly. "You weren't the last." The wind moved through grass, gentle and steady. Harold smiled faintly. He still missed Eben. Every day. But the pain no longer asked him to disappear. It asked him to stay. One night, as Harold closed the barn, Luna stood a fence where Eben once waited. She didn't replace him. She didn't try to. She simply stood there, keeping watch. Harold rested his hand on the fence beside her. "I'll be here," he whispered, "as long as I can." The moon rose over the pasture, casting silver light across the land. For the first time in a long while, Harold felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not joy, not relief, purpose, the kind that doesn't erase loss, but honors it.